blazing house fire illuminates cold-blooded homicide and has possibly destroyed all evidence leading to the killer. It looked like a suicide. Now investigators aren't so sure. The clues are unusual, but do they add up to murder? A killer tries to steer investigators down the wrong road. Can forensics get them back on course? To solve a case, authorities have to know who to trust. That can be a challenge when key players bear false witness. At 6:37 a.m. on August 2nd, 1992, the Evansville, Indiana fire station sprang into action at the report of a burning house. A woman was trapped inside. Intense heat foiled their rescue attempts. The billowing smoke became impenetrable. It was thickest in the bedroom, where the victim was purported to be. The fierce blaze was quickly extinguished, but too late. They couldn't save her. Any loss of life is tragic, but this one struck a personal note with some of the officers on the scene. The call had been made by Evansville police officer Patrick Bradford, who had stopped by the house after his shift and noticed the smoke. The house belonged to 24-year-old Tammy Lohr. Now she was dead. Lohr worked as a civilian jailer for the county. She dreamed of a life in law enforcement and hoped to one day become a police officer.
All right, what we got was where the body was on the bed.
Once the fire was extinguished and the victim removed, investigators walked through the house to see what might have caused it.
They're examining that. They got.
To Evansville fire investigator Jesse Story, the evidence led to one conclusion.
We were able to determine that the fire was suspicious in nature very early on, after we made an initial walkthrough of the building and had determined there were some burn patterns in the carpet that were suspicious and very much similar to those produced when a liquid accelerant is poured on the floor.
And what they did is as he came out,
the fire burned a trail on the carpet leading from the bed to the bedroom door. A gasoline can still stood at the epicenter of the blaze. Carpet samples were collected to confirm the presence of the accelerant. Investigators found other signs of foul play. An electrical engineer determined that circuit breakers to the bedroom had been switched off at the box, not tripped by an electrical problem caused by the fire. The phone lines had been cut and shorted together. Anyone calling would have heard a busy signal. And the scuttle hole cover, the hatch leading to the attic, was lying on the floor just outside the bedroom. Soot deposits revealed it had been removed prior to the blaze. Evansville Police Department crime scene investigator Michael Ford witnessed the result.
It was obvious the fire that came out of the room vented through the scuttle cover just right outside the bedroom door, which would have helped vent the fire and let the fire burn a little bit more. It would have taken the fire into the attic and created a more extensive burn on the house.
A smoke detector collected from the scene was missing its battery.
Did y'all guys check the window?
Yeah, well, you guys didn't cut this out.
As the investigators finished with the bedroom area, they looked at the rest of the house. In the kitchen, they found the window propped open with one of the victim's rings. And the screen had been cut. They presumed this was the murderer's entry point. But they weren't entirely certain. For one thing, it was small and not easily accessible.
This is the exact size and everything of the kitchen window. And one of the unique things about it was right below this window at a level about right here, there was a kitchen sink. And on the back of the kitchen sink were several items that had someone come in through this window would have been knocked over. There were some pots and pans that would have made a substantial amount of noise by someone coming through the window.
Investigators also noted that if this were a break-in, the motive wasn't clear. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Attention focused on the window, the alleged point of entry. Something wasn't right about it. In fact, working with a model of the window, investigators determined that whoever cut the screen wasn't breaking in, but breaking out. Based on the angle of the slash through the screen, Ford believed that it most likely had been cut from the inside.
And indicating that a right-handed person would have had to almost cut this screen from the inside, leaning over the counter, because the screen goes from a lower area on the right-hand side to a higher area on the left-hand side, indicating that a right-handed person would have been more than likely to make that pattern from the inside as opposed to the outside.
While investigators pondered the clues, Officer Bradford drove himself to the police station to answer questions about what he saw before he reported the fire. Because Bradford had entered the burning house and was the last person near the body, as part of standard procedure, he handed over his uniform so it could be tested. Investigators hoped it would yield evidence that might have otherwise been destroyed by the flames in the house. Patrick Bradford told investigators that the victim was his mistress. He'd last seen her around 10 the previous night on his way to work. When he finished his shift around 6:30 a.m., he stopped by. As he pulled down the street, he saw smoke billowing out of her house. He said he rushed into the burning building, dropped to his knees, and crawled to the bedroom door, where he saw the bed engulfed in flames. He couldn't find Tammy. That's when he radioed for help. Because the break-in looked staged, investigators suspected that Lore might have known her killer and opened the door to him or her. Bradford suggested that Evansville Police Detective Guy Minnis talk to one of Lore's former co-workers.
Patrick told us that Tammy had some problems with another jailer that used to work in the jail with her, and the day that the body was discovered, that was one of the first people that we interviewed.
Come in and ask a few questions.
Lore had once reported her colleague for making sexual comments and using excessive force on the prisoners. It cost him his job and earned Tammy Lore a sworn enemy. He claimed he was home all night and didn't get out of bed until after 7 that morning. His wife vouched for him.
And when I interviewed him, I felt that he was being honest, and I was also looking for his wife's reactions because she was kind of standing in the background as I was talking to him, and when he told us where he was and who he was with, I didn't get any kind of reactions from her. We're running south on Bakey.
By now, the major physical clues to the case had been gathered.
Another one of the pictures of the job.
Still, police had no real suspects and no clear-cut
Pretty well,
motive.
that's a black eye rock.
But their next clue would come from the victim herself. Evansville fire investigators were certain that the fire that destroyed Tammy Lohr's house was intentionally set. But the fire had also apparently destroyed all clues leading to who set it and why. Then the autopsy provided some surprising information. Tammy Lohr hadn't died in the fire. She had been stabbed 21 times and had no smoke in her lungs. She had been murdered before the arson. The fire was apparently an effort to hide blatant homicide. The murder was revealed, but investigator Ford thought the murderer might have succeeded in obliterating his identity.
As far as fiber type evidence and things like that, because of the fire, we knew that a lot of that evidence was going to be destroyed. Unfortunately, we would not be able to do the vacuumings of the floor, the search of the bedclothes for hair and fiber of a perpetrator. That was going to be destroyed.
We can take and open this up and test it.
Police hoped that Officer Bradford's uniform might hold some clues the fire destroyed. At the lab, Jesse Story analyzed the uniform for traces of accelerant. Petroleum-based hydrocarbon accelerants are, by their nature, highly volatile. The hydrocarbon detector is sensitively calibrated to electronically sniff for the chemicals as they evaporate. It can detect flammable molecules on the order of 1 part per million. Investigators found no trace of the accelerant on Bradford's uniform. That made sense. He said he crawled into the house and stopped at the bedroom door. The accelerant had been confined to the bedroom, so Bradford wouldn't have picked any up on his clothes. Tests on the bedroom carpet confirmed that it was saturated with it. In the lab, fibers clinging to Bradford's uniform were compared to fibers taken from the victim's home. Bradford's uniform had not a single fiber on it from the house. That was peculiar, considering he said he'd crawled through the home to save Tammy. If Bradford really did crawl across the carpet, he would have had to pick up fibers. Bradford's story started to fray. Investigators felt that he and his wife, Dawn, might know more than they were admitting. Authorities knew that Bradford had been seeing Lohr behind his wife's back for 4 years. The affair showed no sign of ending anytime soon. Dawn, who suspected her husband's infidelity, might have seen fit to kill his mistress.
That was a theory that was popular amongst many citizens here in Evansville. They thought that Dawn killed Tammy and that Patrick set the fire to cover up the murder that his wife had committed.
Polygraphs were ordered for Patrick and Dawn Bradford. The test measures the changes in heart rate, respiration, and blood pressure that often occur when a person isn't telling the truth. Dawn passed the lie detector test, showing no prior knowledge of the crime, and was cleared as a suspect. Patrick's results were deemed inconclusive. Another test was scheduled for the following week. Police continued to gather interviews to get a clearer picture of what happened at Tammy Lohr's house.
Maybe you'd like to talk with me.
Sure do. Hi, Mr. Trey. I'm just have a seat over here at my desk. Over here.
Her neighbor said that Bradford, apparently distracted, almost ran into him pulling into the driveway that morning. They greeted each other. Bradford didn't seem frantic, and the neighbor said he didn't see any smoke. Other witnesses said they drove by the house that morning, saw Bradford's car in the driveway, and also didn't see smoke. By the time the fire engines arrived, 3 minutes, 40 seconds after Bradford made the call, the fire had ravaged the bedroom. Based on the type of fire it was, a mattress doused in gasoline, investigators knew that it burned fast and created blinding amounts of smoke. It couldn't have been on fire long prior to Officer Bradford's arrival. But the larger question was, did it actually start after he arrived? Evansville fire investigator Jesse Story, for one, thought Bradford's statement about his rescue attempt was just a smokescreen.
His description was that he saw flames 6 to 12 inches high and the tips breaking off whenever he got to the bedroom door was not very feasible to us, because we knew what the heat and smoke conditions were whenever accelerant is used in a compartmentalized area such as this bedroom. And it was our contention that had he got that far inside the house, that he definitely would have been overcome by smoke if not killed.
Determining if Bradford had actually set the fire required a down-to-the-second reconstruction of the events that morning. In order to prove Bradford had time to burn the house, Minnis began to create a detailed timeline of the suspect's activity. He realized Bradford would have had to drive past an ATM on his way to Tammy Lohr's house. Its camera faced the street. Detective Minnis requested a copy of the ATM tape for the morning of the fire. Sure enough, it showed Bradford's car driving in the direction of Lohr's house at 6:34 a.m. "65 seconds later, he called the fire department. Minnis, stopwatch in hand, retraced Bradford's route. It took him only 18 seconds to go from the ATM to the victim's house.
When I drove the route, I found that Bradford could commit the crime of arson in the 65 seconds that he had, from the time that he drove by the ATM until the time that he called in the fire on his walkie-talkie. He had plenty of time to pour out the gasoline, set it on fire, and then call the fire in.
But arson was only part of the story. He couldn't have had enough time to kill Tammy Lohr, tamper with the electricity and phone, stage a break-in, and then set the fire. That part of the story had yet to be told. Investigators hoped that Patrick Bradford would tell it. He kept his appointment for his second polygraph test and was asked questions specific to the staging of the scene. He denied involvement. He failed.
The sergeant and I both interviewed Patrick Bradford at that time once we knew that he had failed the polygraph test. And that's when I knew for certain that we had the right guy. Go up into the attic.
Now, investigators had to prove it. The current timeline didn't allow enough time for Bradford to murder Tammy. They reasoned that just because the fire was started in the morning didn't mean that that was when the murder took place. The condition of the body made time of death impossible to determine. But Tammy had spoken to her father on the phone at 10:30 the night before the fire.
You can kind of see right there.
So she was murdered between then and 6:30 the next morning.
Underneath the kitchen window where the burglary was set up.
Investigators looked into Officer Bradford's timesheets the night before the fire. They found one gap in his report. Shortly before 11 p.m., he radioed in that he needed to run some errands. Then there was a break of about an hour when he could not be accounted for.
Patrick, of course, told us that he never went by the house at any point in time during that evening, other than when he was going to work in his personal car and he stopped by to see Tammy for a few minutes. Then he continued on to work and got his police car.
Working with this new time frame, detectives went back to their files. They re-interviewed neighbors about what they might have seen. One woman was driving above the speed limit through the neighborhood and saw a police cruiser parked at the victim's house. She checked her speed and slowed down. It was around 11 p.m.
Come on, guys. Over here. No way.
Evansville investigators had now placed Bradford at the house the night before and proved he had enough time to commit murder. They felt they'd gathered enough evidence against one of their own. Officer Patrick Bradford was arrested for the murder of Tammy Lore. As for motive, lately Bradford and Lore were having difficulties. Police surmised that on the night of August 1st, the two had an argument that was settled by murder. The passerby had placed Bradford at the scene, and his logbook showed he had the opportunity. He returned to the house the following morning, as was his habit. Only this was to be the last time. He finished what he'd started, pouring the gasoline and striking the match. Patrick Bradford was convicted of murder and arson. He was sentenced to 80 years. Murders, like clandestine love affairs, require an elaborate deception. But that level of deceit can seldom bear close scrutiny. It's easy to see how a place like Farmville gets its name. The little community of about 6,000 people, nestled in the rolling hills of central Virginia, retains its rural charm in a fast-paced world. But even a quiet town like this is not immune to tragedy. On December 11, 1991, just after 1 p.m., Farmville police received a call about a shooting at the home of Robert Bruce. Detective Jack Bryant was dispatched to the scene. Though shootings are uncommon here, this one wasn't totally unexpected.
I was driving on South Main Street. I received a radio call from a dispatcher to go to 600 High Street. There had been a shooting, and my immediate reaction was that Mr. Bruce had shot himself because he was scheduled for sentencing on an embezzlement charge.
Farmville police began the case with an assumption that proved wrong the instant Robert Bruce answered the door. They were surprised to find that Robert Bruce wasn't the victim. They were even more surprised to learn that it was his wife, Carol, who had apparently committed suicide. Robert Bruce told detectives that he and Carol had an argument that morning.
Half hour, 45 minutes ago maybe.
He took their children to school, returned to the house for a brief period, and then left to go to an appointment at the bank.
I don't know, she can.
When he returned home, he found her dead. Carol Bruce lay on the sofa in the den, a bullet to her head. Any crime scene, even a suicide, must be thoroughly documented. Before anything was touched or moved, every inch was photographed and measured. The room was much warmer than the rest of the house, and the victim was covered with an Afghan. A .32 caliber Colt revolver lay on the carpet. The victim's hand was thrust awkwardly into a gardening glove. Though it appeared to be a suicide, these details raised doubts in Detective Bryant's mind.
And the glove was just partially on the hand. It wasn't on a hand as someone would normally put a glove on.
Investigators compiled a growing list of troubling details. They noted that the gun was more than 2 feet from the victim's trigger hand, and that the overheated room would change the body temperature and thwart attempts to gauge an accurate time of death. It all seemed too suspicious. Detectives began to doubt that Carol Bruce took her own life. They feared she might have had help. In Farmville, Virginia, as Detective Bryant investigated the mysterious death of Carol Bruce, he began to suspect that she had been murdered. To prove it, he started with the gun. A trace of the serial number revealed that it was local. He went to talk with the owner. It had been reported stolen to Detective Bryant 5 months earlier, taken out of a car in the Bruce's neighborhood. The owner made no secret of the fact that he kept the gun in his vehicle. But he had no idea how it ended up in Carol Bruce's hand. At the morgue, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim was killed by a single bullet to the brain. It entered the right temple and lodged in the lower left portion of her head. But the autopsy couldn't explain who fired it.
The initial results of the autopsy was that it was a routine suicide. And the department did not actually make a ruling on it. The chief left that to me to do. And any time that I was contacted about it, I just said it has not been ruled a suicide or a homicide. Is still under investigation.
The gun and the slug retrieved from the victim's skull were sent to the Virginia State Crime Lab. There, the gun was test-fired. The water chamber stops the bullet without adding extraneous marks. Usually, that allows investigators to compare the test-fired bullet with ones at a crime scene. But in this case, the lands and grooves of the crime scene bullet were too faint to be read. As a formality, investigators examined the cartridge casing taken from the scene with one test fired in the lab. By comparing the markings on the two casings, technicians determined that the fatal shot was fired from the weapon found near the victim. Less certain was who fired it. Detective Bryant had some doubts. Bryant wasn't alone in his suspicions.
I appreciate you coming in.
Carol's friends had told him that even though Carol and Robert were having marital problems, she was excited about planning her future. Carol taught physical education at the local college and was preparing to earn her doctorate. Then, 3 days before she was scheduled to take her graduate school exam, she was found dead. Carol's friends also told Bryant that the idea she shot herself seemed unlikely.
She was petrified of any type of gun. She just didn't allow them in the house. So that was another thing I couldn't believe. Number one, I couldn't believe that she would have stolen it to begin with. And number two, I could certainly that she would not have killed herself with it.
There had been no sign of an intruder in the house, so if it wasn't suicide, the most logical suspect was Robert Bruce, the beneficiary of his wife's $100,000 life insurance policy.
You have a lovely day.
Bruce had been an attorney, but he'd just been convicted of embezzling $30,000 from his clients and forced to pay restitution. He needed the money. Carol had contacted a divorce attorney to end their 16-year marriage. Her lawyer requested that Robert send him his financial records. But he hadn't filed his taxes for 5 years. After Carol's death, Robert Bruce was sentenced to several months in jail for embezzling. While he was incarcerated, the death investigation continued. Bryant had established a possible motive, but what of the opportunity? He was determined to get some resolution to this mystery.
This case just stayed on my mind all the time. I could wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and this case was on my mind just as strong as it was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It just stayed with me. I couldn't get it out of my mind, and I knew it had to come to an end somewhere.
Bryant consulted his notes from Bruce's interview to reconstruct his movements on the morning of his wife's death. The school had a record of him dropping off his kids first thing. Then, Bruce said he puttered around the rental apartments he owned, but nobody saw him there. Then he had a meeting at the bank with an attorney. Investigators spoke with the attorney, who said that he had met with Robert Bruce that morning between 11 o'clock and 12 noon. Bruce left immediately after the meeting. His movements afterward were vouched for by his cousin's wife. She worked in an apparel shop, and Bruce stopped by to chat a while, as he frequently did. He left around 1 o'clock and returned home, where his wife lay dead.
As far as his whereabouts for the day, we had roughly from 9 to 11 that he could not actually prove where he was at. All of the other times he had witnesses.
That gap could have given Bruce the opportunity to kill his wife. Now, Bryant hoped forensics could prove she had died in that time frame. For help, he contacted Virginia State Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro. But estimating the time of death would be tricky.
Time of death is always an estimate. It's an estimate made based on when the person was last reliably seen alive, and the operative word there is reliably, and when the person was found.
Although Carol Bruce's body temperature suggested she died shortly before the police arrived, rigor mortis had already begun to set in. That typically takes several hours.
It appeared that she was dead for more hours than was reported.
In fact, Fierro's time of death estimate correlated with Robert Bruce's window of opportunity.
Right.
Investigators faced one last challenge. Bruce's motive and opportunity were now firmly established. In order to prove that he pulled the trigger, they had to first prove that the victim couldn't possibly have pulled it herself. At the Virginia Division of Forensic Science in Richmond, Forensic Science Supervisor Ann Davis ran a trigger pull test to see if Carol Bruce, while partially wearing a gardening glove, fired the gun that ended her life. Davis added progressively more weight to the trigger to determine how much pressure the shooter would need to squeeze off a round. Tests determined that it would take at least 9 1/4 pounds of finger pressure to pull the trigger. Hampered by the glove, it would have been difficult, if not impossible, to manage it. After the trigger pull test, Firearm and Toolmark Section Chief Jim Pickleman approached the case from another angle. He reconstructed the crime scene based on photos, and he constructed a mannequin and a dummy head to replicate the fatal bullet's trajectory. He found that the angle of the shot would have been too awkward for the victim to manage on her own. And the powder burns indicated that the gun was pushed directly against her head, which wasn't typical. The tests proved that the distance of the gun and the trajectory of the bullet were inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound. Investigators finally had the proof they needed. Carol Bruce did not pull that trigger. In May 1993, Robert Bruce, having served his time for embezzling, was arrested again for murder. Police surmised that on the morning of her death, Carol had fallen asleep on the sofa. Robert came in with the gun stolen several months earlier. He turned up the thermostat to distort time of death estimates. He donned a glove to keep his own hands clean. Then he killed his wife with a single bullet, staged the scene to look like a suicide, covered her with a blanket, and slipped the glove awkwardly onto her hand.
The Bruce case represents a special kind of situation in forensic pathology. We call these masquerades. These are deaths where what you are seeing is not really what happened, and someone is trying to arrange a death to look like a death, a type of death which it is not.
Ultimately, Robert Bruce was unmasked by forensics. For his crime, he was sentenced to life. In masquerade deaths, investigators follow the evidence down two trails. One leads to the cause of death. The other, more twisted trail, leads to the killer. Around 10 p.m. on June 12, 1994, police were called to the scene of a car accident on a secluded road in Little Mountain, South Carolina. A woman had apparently driven off the road and crashed. She was dead at the scene. Yet, strangely, her vehicle was barely scratched. Officers of SLED, the South Carolina State Law Enforcement Division, processed the vehicle. They found drops of blood in the back seat, damage to the car's interior, and the gear was in neutral. A footprint on the rear passenger side window suggested a violent struggle. Newberry, South Carolina Sheriff Lee Foster knew this was more than a tragic accident.
We noticed that there was absolutely no damage done to the vehicle, and certainly nothing that would have caused the blood or the injuries to the body. So all of those items in connection, I mean, it wasn't a traffic accident. It looked like something else had happened.
Only after the obvious clues were documented did the investigators search for the driver's identification. She was Victoria Beckham. Authorities had done all they could at the scene.
I don't know.
While her family was notified, the victim was removed and the car towed to the SLED laboratory for closer scrutiny. Police notified Stephen Beckham about his wife's death and their suspicions of foul play. He immediately came to the station to answer questions. He said he'd seen Vicki around 6:15 that evening when she dropped the kids off at his house. Vicki was separated from her husband and had moved back in with her parents. She and Stephen shared custody of their 3 children. Since the separation, she'd gotten a job and was preparing to sue Stephen for full custody. The autopsy confirmed suspicions of foul play. Vicki Beckham was shown to have blunt force trauma to her head and neck. The medical examiner determined that she'd been killed by asphyxiation due to a crushed windpipe. Whatever crushed it left unusual and unrecognizable markings. This was not the kind of injury one would sustain in a car accident. Because her body was already beginning to cool and stiffen when it was discovered at 10 p.m., her time of death was estimated to have been around 6:30, shortly after leaving her husband's house.
Stephen Beckham was the last person to have seen her alive. The investigators narrowed it down to the fact that she delivered the children, he saw her, and we needed to follow up further on that.
Because Beckham's house was the last place the victim had been seen alive, officers obtained a warrant to search it. They found nothing but a tennis shoe with what appeared to be a single drop of blood. That wasn't necessarily unusual, unless the blood happened to be from the murder victim. The tennis shoe was sent to the State Law Enforcement Division Forensic Laboratory, where forensic serologist Nancy Scraba tested it. First, she removed the stain with a cotton swab dampened with saline solution. Then she tested the swab by adding phenolphthalein and hydrogen peroxide. The chemical combination reacts with the hemoglobin in blood and turns pink. To prove it was blood, and more specifically human blood, Scraba used a process called crossover electrophoresis, which isolated the proteins and revealed them to be human. Unfortunately, the sample wasn't large enough to reveal the blood type. The same couldn't be said for the victim's car. Copious blood samples were collected from the front and back seat areas and also from the exterior rear door.
Okay.
All were tested and all were type A, the same as the victim's. Forensics had another tool in its arsenal. After the blood, fibers, and other samples were collected, the vehicle was processed for latent fingerprints. Fingerprinting is always the last step because the processes used to reveal latent prints can destroy other evidence. More than 30 prints or partial prints were eventually raised on the car. Many belonged to the Beckhams, some belonged to rescue workers, and most were difficult to read. SLED Senior Agent David Warren Black knew he had his work cut out for him.
They're not the pristine, picture-perfect thing that you would see. They were torqued, they were smeared, they were smudged. They're partial fragmentary impressions. Some may have even been the size, say, of a pencil eraser.
And each had to be compared against a database of hundreds and hundreds of known prints. It would take some time. But investigators were encouraged by the discovery of a partial smeared print stamped in blood on the car's exterior.
The fact that the print was in blood placed that print being put there after bloodletting occurred. So it could have only gotten placed there after Mrs. Beckham was assaulted.
While the print was being analyzed, police returned to the murder scene and stopped motorists to see if anyone driving by on the night of the murder might have witnessed anything. Several reported seeing a gold-colored car parked near the scene earlier that day. Sheriff Lee Foster felt the vehicle could be crucial.
The car was an important factor because it could have been involved in the murder, or it could have been somebody that witnessed it.
None who'd seen it could recall its make, model, or license number. Then, one man pulled over. He'd gotten a good look at it.
He said it was definitely a Pontiac. It was a Pontiac Grand Prix, and it was gold color, and he even went as far as talk about the type of wheels that it had on the car.
I said I had one just like it was the only year they made that.
And he said he knew it was a Pontiac Grand Prix because he had had a car earlier in his life similar to that, just not the same color. And he went on to tell us that the gold color was a very distinctive gold, that he didn't know that General Motors made a car that color anymore.
A check of motor vehicle records revealed hundreds of Grand Prix, but the database couldn't break them down by color. Far too many to check. A year passed with few leads and no real suspects. The paper and TV news did follow-up pieces on Vicki Beckham's murder. They focused on the gold car, apparently the only clue, and asked the public for information about it.
How we doing today, Earl?
I'm doing all right.
The reports jump-started the memory of an acquaintance of Stephen Beckham's. He told detectives that Stephen was a regular at a Myrtle Beach strip club, and a gold Grand Prix was parked in front of the club most of the time. Investigators checked the DMV dead file and found an expired registration for a 1980 Grand Prix that was owned by the proprietor of the strip club. Investigators also checked Beckham's phone records and found that he had made hundreds of calls to payphones in Myrtle Beach and to the strip club in the weeks prior to the murder. It was time to pay a visit to the owner of the club and bring along a search warrant. The proprietor admitted the car was his, but told investigators that a year earlier he'd loaned it to one of his bouncers, a man named Richard Anderson. The police had the car towed to the lab, where they could get a better look at it. The crime happened over a year earlier, and investigators weren't certain this was the car they were looking for. Nevertheless, they combed it for clues. In the trunk, they raised fingerprints that didn't match the owner's.
I've never seen her before in my life.
Police found the bouncer, Richard Anderson. He agreed to take a polygraph regarding his involvement with the Beckham murder. He denied knowing Beckham or anything about the murder. He failed. Investigators broke the news to him.
Never seen her before.
Anderson decided that he didn't want to cooperate anymore, but would give us hair, blood, and other forensic samples to conduct DNA testing because we were looking into the forensic aspect of the case as well.
But on the way to the hospital, Anderson requested that he be taken to the Attorney General's office. He had a confession to make. Richard Anderson, the key suspect in the murder of Vicki Beckham, decided to come clean. His confession revealed he was part of a deadly plan.
Anderson told us that he was contracted to kill Vicki Beckham because of the situation that was going on between Stephen and Vicki. His stories changed from time to time, but it never changed the fact that he was contracted by Stephen Beckham to get rid of the body.
Anderson said that the weekend before the murder, he and Beckham met face-to-face to finalize their plans. Prior to that, they had planned much of the murder through a series of telephone calls at pre-arranged locations. These locations matched Beckham's phone records. Beckham's plan was to murder Vicki after she came to his house to drop off the kids. She was supposed to be dead when Beckham delivered her to Anderson. But she was merely unconscious after Beckham had pistol-whipped her. Anderson was able to describe the gun that Beckham used for the beating. Anderson admitted that after Beckham left, he killed the victim with a bolt cutter, then staged the car accident. At the lab, technicians looked for evidence to prove that Anderson's story was true. Bolt cutters found in his house were analyzed for trace evidence. None was found, but the pathologist determined that the fatal injury was consistent with being struck by the tool. Anderson's fingerprints were compared to those found on the gold Grand Prix and the car where Vicki was found murdered. They matched. Investigators had enough to arrest Stephen Beckham and search his house. When they arrived, he was nowhere to be found. However, they did find a handgun like the one Anderson described. Forensics determined that the marks on the victim's head were consistent with characteristics of the handgun. Investigators had placed Anderson at the scene. They used the phone records to link Beckham to the crime. Stephen Beckham was arrested 4 days later in Chapin, South Carolina. According to Anderson's statements and what investigators could piece together, Vicki dropped the kids off at Stephen's house. Stephen somehow persuaded her to take a short drive with him. When they got to a secluded, prearranged place, Stephen stopped the vehicle. He beat Vicki into unconsciousness, then delivered her to Anderson. But she wasn't dead. When Anderson saw she was alive, he finished the job. Then he staged the accident. Detective Foster believed that Stephen bitterly resented Vicky's newfound independence and success. He had lost control of her and was in danger of losing his children. To keep his kids, he needed his wife out of the way.
He had previously convinced Vicky that she was never going to get custody of the children, but now she realized that that wasn't true. So there was going to be a hard custody battle going on.
For the murder of Vicky Beckham, Richard Anderson and Stephen Beckham were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Murderers often believe that they can hide their crimes behind a simple lie. In reality, they're only lying to themselves. The truth is in the evidence, and the evidence is always stacked against the false witness. Seven years after a woman vanishes, a trail of evidence leads investigators to an isolated boat ramp on the Missouri River. They must pull proof of her murder from the murky river. In a rural Virginia county, a skull and a piece of jewelry are the only clues police have to identify a victim. But will it be enough to catch a killer? A woman is missing for weeks. When her body is discovered, the police must piece together their case from a few torn shreds of tape. When someone disappears, it's difficult for police to prove murder without a body. But today, forensic science can find justice for a victim months and sometimes even years after they have gone missing. Maryville, Missouri is a small Midwestern town. But in 1990, it was caught in the grip of a big city problem. To combat a growing methamphetamine industry, investigators sought help from those on the inside. Christine Elkins had been arrested for selling the drug. In exchange for immunity, Christine cooperated with authorities by helping to build a case against her supplier. She agreed to tape their next meeting with a microcassette recorder concealed in her clothing. On July 26, 1990, under the watchful eyes of investigators, Elkins met with the distributor at his house.
You got the stuff?
From the moment she walked in, Tony Emery, her dealer, was suspicious.
What are you doing?
He grabbed Christine and searched her.
I don't know what you're talking about.
No, you are.
He threatened to kill her if she ever betrayed him.
When you cool off, okay?
Agent Mike Schmitz headed up the case for the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
She came back afterwards extremely upset, stating that he knew that I was wired. He attempted to locate the recorder. She was extremely upset.
Christine told agents that she was afraid for her safety. They urged her to stay away from Tony. When agents tried to listen to the tape, it was indecipherable. The case against Tony Emery would have to be made on informant testimony. A few weeks before Christine was scheduled to testify against him, police received a call from her mother. She hadn't heard from her daughter in several days, and she was worried. A search of Christine's house indicated no sign of a struggle. Her car, a maroon Oldsmobile, was gone. Missouri State Police worked with the ATF on the Emery narcotics case. Investigator Larry Bodenhammer.
Well, the investigation changed after her disappearance because after a period of time, it was like, well, where is she? You know, what has happened to her? Has she left on her own accord, or has something happened to her?
Investigators interviewed Christine's friends and acquaintances. One friend told police she'd seen her around 10 o'clock the night she disappeared. Christine had asked her to watch her son for a few minutes while she met someone. Christine made a chilling prediction as she left. If she wasn't back in a few minutes, she'd be in the morgue. No one had seen her since.
All right, I need to bring everybody up to date.
The ATF and the police now suspected that Tony Emery was behind her disappearance. He had a strong motive, but without evidence of an actual crime, authorities could not prove his involvement. 3 weeks later, Maryville police received a tip from a federal drug enforcement agent in Colorado.
Sergeant Strong.
A methamphetamine manufacturer facing time in federal prison wanted to make a deal. He claimed he knew about the murder of a female informant in Maryville.
All right, that'll work.
Investigators feared he was referring to Christine Elkins. Maryville police and ATF agents flew to Colorado to question James Witt. He told them he manufactured methamphetamine for Tony Emery and his cousin Herb Emery. He said he'd heard the two men talking about killing an informant in Missouri. In exchange for leniency, Witt agreed to meet Herb Emery and wear a wire. Authorities hoped their conversation would provide details of the alleged murder and possibly lead them to Christine Elkins. 3 months after Christine's disappearance, Witt met Herb Emery in a restaurant parking lot. Agents listened to their conversation from a car nearby. Witt pretended he needed to get rid of a body and asked for advice. Herb Emery told him the best way to dispose of a body was to put it in the trunk of a car and sink it in a rock quarry. It was investigators' first clue. Using detailed maps, they identified rock quarries deep enough to conceal a car. But the Midwest, famous for its native limestone, had literally hundreds of quarries. To narrow their search further, they had to think like a killer.
If you've got a person in the trunk of the car, what would you do? Would you drive a long ways when it wasn't your car? You could break down. If you were to find a rock quarry, it would have to be something close. It would have to be something that you didn't have to drive. It's a very wet season. You wouldn't have to drive through a field because you might get stuck.
They focused on a 75-mile radius, but that still left hundreds of possibilities. Over the next several months, investigators systematically searched those rock quarries for a car containing a body. They found nothing. The ATF, the Missouri State Police, and Maryville Police considered the Emerys dangerous, but lacked sufficient evidence to support a murder charge. Setting up a task force, investigators devised a strategy to get them off the street until they could prove murder. Federal agents again used James Witt, this time to set up a methamphetamine buy. Herb and Tony Emery met Witt at a prearranged location. Agents observed as Tony Emery gave Witt $20,000 for several pounds of the drug.
ATF, on the floor!
They moved in to make the arrest.
Don't move.
In the summer of 1991, Herb and Tony Emery were convicted of conspiracy to keep and sell methamphetamine. They were sentenced to 9 years in a federal penitentiary. With the Emerys in prison, authorities were able to focus on the disappearance and possible homicide of Christine Elkins. According to Maryville police investigator Randy Strong, Tony Emery was a dangerous man to cross.
The community had a great fear of Tony Emery. If we had a witness to him doing a crime, they simply wouldn't come forward, or they would back out of the case. No one wanted to talk about it because they were afraid of what he might do to them.
But with the Emery cousins safely behind bars, authorities hoped their associates would no longer be afraid to talk. And they had a lead. In their taped conversations, Herb Emery had told James Witt about a third man who was present the night of the murder. Bobby Miller was a friend of Herb's in Colorado. But when investigators tried to question Miller, they got nowhere. Even from prison, the Emerys cast a frightening shadow. Investigators went to one of the Emerys' rental properties mentioned in a monitored conversation between Herb Emery and James Witt. They suspected that this was the site where Christine had been murdered. The woman who answered the door confirmed that she rented the house from the Emerys. Once inside, investigators were dismayed to find the house had been gutted and remodeled. If Christine had been murdered on the premises, all evidence of the crime had been destroyed. Out of options, the investigators re-examined their case files, looking for a clue, something they might have missed the first time, that would link the Emerys to Christine's murder. Investigators found phone records linking Bobby Miller to Herb Emery around the time Christine disappeared. They also learned that Bobby Miller had rented a truck near Maryville the night Christine was last seen. It suggested his involvement, but they had to find a way to get him to talk.
Yeah, this is pretty creepy.
In September 1996, 6 years after Christine's disappearance, police went back to Miller.
Okay, Bobby, you know why
They
you're
offered
here
him
today.
immunity in exchange for his testimony.
And your attorney has given us
On the
permission
advice of
to
his
give your
attorney,
statement.
Miller took the deal.
You really pin all this down?
Miller admitted he was outside Herb Emery's rental property the night Christine Elkins disappeared. He said he watched her go inside, where Herb and Tony waited. When he heard screams, he panicked and drove off. Investigators believed they knew what happened next. But without a body, making a murder case against the Emerys would be difficult, if not impossible. 7 years had passed since Christine Elkins' disappearance. The ATF and the Maryville, Missouri police had Bobby Miller's account of her murder, but no evidence to back it up. And they were running out of time. The suspects in her disappearance, Tony and Herb Emery, were about to be paroled from prison. Determined to prevent their release, authorities scrutinized every facet of their case. They decided to take a closer look at the Emerys' associates. Dana Kleiser wasn't directly involved with Emery or his drug ring. In fact, investigators interviewed him only because Tony had once dated his sister. According to Kleiser, Tony Emery arrived at his rural home the night Christine disappeared. He asked to borrow some gas, then asked Kleiser to show him a nearby boat ramp. Wary of Emery's reputation, Kleiser didn't ask any questions, but led him to a boat ramp on the Missouri River. Tony told him to wait several miles away. Pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Investigators now believed they knew the location of the car containing Christine's body.
We now realized that we had to try, at least plan, to recover a body out of the Missouri River. And I think the thing that was going through both of our minds was the Great Flood of 1993. And I know I was thinking that, unfortunately, Christine is probably in the Gulf someplace now after that flood.
The currents of the Missouri River are normally powerful enough to move something the size of a car great distances. During the 1993 floods, the river became a raging torrent that overflowed its banks and caused millions of dollars in damage. It was yet another long shot, but it was all investigators had to go on. To make a case against the Emorys, they had to find Christine's car. They enlisted the help of a non-profit organization called NecroSearch International. These Colorado-based scientists helped law enforcement around the world find clandestine graves and hidden evidence. When Clark Davenport, a forensic geophysicist with NecroSearch, arrived at the boat ramp, he'd already amassed a wealth of data.
Prior to coming out to take magnetic measurements, we looked at the make and model of the car. We talked to the manufacturer to determine the mass of metal in the motor. We also looked at the currents in the river bottom conditions, river speed, the floods that happened since the car had gone into the river, and the float time from the manufacturer, how long they figured a car would float.
Armed with that information, NecroSearch scientists spent 2 days searching a 6-mile area adjacent to the boat ramp. They used a magnetometer, a torpedo-shaped device that measures changes in magnetic fields. Floating several feet below the river's surface, it takes readings every 2 seconds and recognizes large masses such as a car. Used in conjunction with global positioning satellites, the magnetometer enabled NecroSearch scientists to precisely pinpoint 5 locations where abnormal masses, or anomalies, were present on the riverbed.
I felt pretty confident that the anomalies were consistent with what I would expect from a car of that size.
The next day, investigators returned to the boat ramp with a team of divers. Fighting the murky river's current, the divers searched the 5 areas Davenport pinpointed as likely locations for the car. Within hours, one of the divers surfaced holding up a Missouri license plate. Against all odds, investigators had finally found Christine Elkins' car.
This was an incredible moment. It was kind of like Excalibur coming up out of the lake with the sword. You know, it's just amazing. You know, just the emotion that was involved in that. We knew that we were getting closer now. We were going to put closure on this case.
Divers attached steel cables to the car and pulled it from the water. It was sent to a Maryville garage for processing. Inside, forensic examiners discovered a piece of wood wedged between the driver's seat and the accelerator. In the trunk, they found bones wrapped in carpet padding. Using hospital x-rays, the medical examiner confirmed that they had finally found the remains of Christine Elkins. The autopsy revealed a large hole in the skull, consistent with blunt force trauma. Christine had apparently been beaten to death. Investigators had the physical evidence they needed to charge the Emorys with murder. They believed Tony found out Christine was going to testify against him and offered her money to disappear. She was too terrified to turn him down. But when she went to the house that night, the Emerys had other plans. Once inside, Tony and Herb attacked Christine. Tony dealt the lethal blow, striking her in the head with a heavy flashlight. Her body was wrapped in carpet padding, put in the trunk of her car, and driven to the boat ramp. There, Tony rigged the accelerator and sent the car down the ramp into the river. Herb Emery pled guilty to murder and was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Tony Emery was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In Maryville, authorities knew the name of the victim and suspected killers, but struggled for 7 years to find her body. In a rural Virginia county, investigators had to identify a body before the search for a murderer could even begin. Amelia County is a sprawling community, located in the rolling hills of western Virginia. It's a neighborly area with a low crime rate. Not the place for murder. In 1990, while hunting for deer, a man made a gruesome discovery. On an embankment near a small creek, he found a human skull. He took it to the Amelia County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Jimmy Weaver examined the skull. Its condition told him it had been outside for some time. The presence of a long reddish hair, as well as the skull's small size and features, suggested that the victim was probably female. 2 opposing holes in the skull were consistent with entry and exit wounds made by a single bullet. Sheriff Weaver and his deputy went out to the scene.
On my way in, I was trying to think of who it could be. There was no one in Amelia missing. No one had called me. Amelia is a small, close county. If something happens, we know right away.
After securing the area, Weaver conducted a thorough search. They found more bones, jewelry, part of a blanket, and a piece of denim. Concerned that animals might have scattered additional clues, the investigators broadened their search. They soon discovered what appeared to be an arm bone and a gold bracelet. The evidence seemed to confirm Sheriff Weaver's original theory that the victim was female. Weaver sent the evidence to the Virginia State Medical Examiner's office in Richmond for analysis. Chief Medical Examiner Marcella Fierro examined the remains. The skull told her a great deal about the victim.
First, it showed that it was a young white female. Second, it showed that it had a gunshot wound and that there was injury related to this gunshot wound, and that the trajectory of where this bullet went in and where it fractured on the other side indicated it had a path that was lethal.
As the examination of the skeletal remains continued, the medical examiner's office was able to establish that the victim had been 5 feet 2 to 5 feet 4 inches tall, with reddish blonde hair. The description was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the state of Virginia. The search was on for any missing women matching Amelia County's Jane Doe. Now, Sheriff Weaver could only hope and wait. In January 1990, the Sheriff's Department in Amelia County, Virginia, needed a lead to establish the identity of skeletal remains found in an isolated area. It wasn't long in coming. Police in Chesapeake, Virginia, reported that a woman who fit the victim's description had been missing for 8 months. Dental records confirmed the victim was 29-year-old Regina Butkowski, known to her friends as Jeannie. The same day, deputies showed Jeannie's mother the jewelry recovered from the scene. She identified it as her daughter's. Chesapeake police forwarded the Butkowski case files to Amelia County. As Weaver reviewed them, he learned the circumstances of Jeannie's disappearance. On the evening of May 6, 1989, Jeannie's roommate discovered that the front door of their house had been kicked in. Concerned, she checked the parking lot for Jeannie's car. It wasn't there. She called Jeannie's mother, who said she'd last spoken to her daughter at 10:45 the night before. One fact in the police files immediately caught Sheriff Weaver's attention: Jeannie's stormy relationship with a man named Pernell Jefferson. Jeannie had met Jefferson at a local gym. He became her personal trainer, and the two dated for several months. When Jefferson became too possessive, Jeannie tried to distance herself from him, but he refused to back off.
One of the things that he had somewhat of an obsession with was with Regina. He was not going to accept the fact that she wasn't his.
Jefferson's obsession had become frighteningly clear when he allegedly kidnapped Jeannie in March 1989. But by an amazing stroke of luck, more than 7 minutes of that struggle had been recorded on her home answering machine.
It was a very dramatic tape. No one really knew how it was recorded, but it was. And it was a situation where you would hear her telling, "No, Pernell, don't hurt me, don't do things." And it proceeded on. You could hear noise in the background. And probably one of the most dramatic things of it is that at one time you heard this tremendously deep sob from Regina.
Weaver learned that Jeannie's roommate told Jefferson about the tape and threatened to call police. He released Jeannie. She refused to press charges against him, however, out of fear he might take out his anger on someone close to her. 2 months later, Jeannie Butkowski again disappeared. Sheriff Weaver focused the investigation on Pernell Jefferson. A lead came in from Jeannie's parents. They had received a letter regarding their daughter's car from an apartment complex in Richmond, Virginia, 130 miles away from Jeannie's home. The manager of the apartments alerted them that Jeannie's car had been sitting in the parking lot for 6 months. Investigators examined her car, hoping for clues to link Jefferson to the murder. They were disappointed. During the time the car had been there, it had been subjected to the elements.
When they had the flood in Richmond, it had been submerged in the flood. So a lot of the evidentiary value from that vehicle was lost.
But a new lead was quickly established. A resident of the apartment complex told investigators that he knew a man who used to drive the car. Investigators soon learned that Jeannie's car had changed hands several times. They eventually traced it to a man named Darrell Jones, who was incarcerated in Henrico County. Jones told deputies he bought the car from a local man named Wes Green. Green was with a stranger who claimed the car belonged to his girlfriend. He'd taken it away from her and driven it up from Chesapeake because he was angry with her. Investigators suspected the stranger was Pernell Jefferson. They wanted to know more and believed Wes Green might hold the key. They just needed to find him. As evidence against Pernell Jefferson mounted, the Amelia County Sheriff's Department believed his friend, Wes Green, might know more about the murder of Jeannie Butkowski.
Central.
Deputies quickly tracked Green down to an apartment complex in Richmond. When questioned, he admitted he helped Jefferson get rid of Jeannie's car. The officer persisted. Green added that Jefferson had borrowed a co-worker's car around the time Jeannie disappeared. If the car had been used to dispose of her body, it was probable that incriminating evidence had been left behind. Deputies went to the appliance rental store where Pernell Jefferson had once worked. A co-worker confirmed that on May 5th, the day Jeannie disappeared, Jefferson had borrowed his car. He didn't return the vehicle until late that night. A few days later, Jefferson went to lunch and never returned. Investigators obtained permission to search the employee's car. The search yielded incriminating results. Technicians found traces of lime, a corrosive substance that hastens decomposition. More importantly, they found a reddish blonde hair similar to the one found on Jeannie Butkowski's skull. The hair was sent to the crime lab for analysis. A comparison indicated the two hairs were consistent in texture and color. Investigators now had their first physical evidence connecting Jefferson to Jeannie Butkowski's murder. Sheriff Weaver swore out a warrant for the arrest of Pernell Jefferson on capital murder charges. Authorities traced Jefferson to Stuart, Florida, where he'd moved shortly after Jeannie's disappearance.
Get out! All right! Clear left! Move! Clear!
On February 3rd, 1990, a SWAT team burst into the suspect's home to find him hiding in a closet. They quickly took him into custody.
Don't move.
5 months later, Jefferson was extradited to Amelia County to stand trial for murder. Based on the evidence, investigators pieced together the events of the night Jeannie Butkowski died. On May 5th, 1989, Pernell Jefferson and Wes Green drove from Richmond to Chesapeake and broke into Jeannie's house as she slept. Jeannie struggled with Jefferson, who dragged her outside. He forced her into her own car and sped away. Green left separately. Although investigators never learned the precise location of her murder, they suspected Jefferson stopped at a remote area as he drove back to Richmond. He initially disposed of her body just outside the city. Fearing it might be discovered there, Jefferson recruited Wes Green to help him move the body to Amelia County, where they buried it in a shallow grave. Pernell Jefferson thought he'd covered his tracks, but he underestimated Sheriff Weaver and his deputies.
He thought that he would bring her out to a rural county to where that probably there was a rural law enforcement agency that wouldn't find it, or if they did, wouldn't solve it.
On March 28, 1991, Pernell Jefferson stood trial in Amelia County for killing Jeannie Butkowski. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 25 years. Wes Green was also charged and convicted for his role in Jeannie's abduction. In a murder investigation, police often discover the killer was close to the victim. But when a killer preys on a stranger, he is far more difficult to find. Nestled at the junction of two rivers, Wichita, Kansas is an all-American city with a touch of Old West charm. In this story, some of the names have been changed. On September 17, 1995, a woman phoned the Wichita police to report a missing person. She said her friend, Jody McCown, got into a maroon car on South Broadway around 1:30 the night before and hadn't returned. Most missing persons turn up within a few days, but South Broadway is a tough neighborhood plagued by drugs and prostitution. The Wichita police immediately began looking for Jody McCown. Detectives contacted Becky Sims, the woman who called in the missing persons report, hoping she could give them more information. Becky told them she was with Jody and her boyfriend, Keith Perry, the night Jody disappeared. A man drove up in a maroon car and told them he was looking for drugs. He introduced himself as Chester Higginbotham. Jody and Keith got into the car to talk to him. Becky heard the man offer Jody $200 to help him find drugs. Jody was reluctant, but Keith said they needed the money. He took $100 and got out of the car. Detective Dana Gouge recalls Becky was uneasy about the unusual circumstances of Higginbotham's request.
She was very suspicious of the situation because of the amount of money that was offered to Jody in this situation. She found it very strange. So strange that she wrote down the tag number of the car.
Investigators traced the license plate to a resident named Matthew Murphy, who lived in the nearby town of Newton. They wondered who Chester Higginbotham was and how he was connected to Murphy. They ran a background check on the two men.
I'm working on that now.
They also ran a background check on Jody's boyfriend, Keith Perry. They soon learned he had several outstanding drug warrants. During questioning, Perry confirmed Becky Sims's account of Jody's disappearance, with one major difference. He denied encouraging her to join Higginbotham in the car. Suspicious of Perry's involvement, detectives obtained a warrant to search his apartment. They didn't find anything to implicate him, but collected various items for possible DNA testing later. By now, investigators had the results from the background checks on Chester Higginbotham and Matthew Murphy. A comparison of fingerprints, photographs, and DMV records proved that Matthew Murphy and Chester Higginbotham were the same man. He had arrest records for burglary and theft going back many years under both names. In fact, there were several burglary charges pending against the Murphy alias in Kansas, as well as other states. The identity change and arrest records made Lieutenant Ken Landwehr of the Wichita Police Department highly suspicious.
When we find out that Matthew Murphy is an alias for Chester Higginbotham, it's again a clue that's going to show us that he's trying to hide his background, which has to mean that if he's hiding his background, there's probably something there that's more serious than burglaries and thefts.
Police called Higginbotham, who readily admitted he picked up Jody McCown on September 16th. But he said he dropped her off later and hadn't seen her since. Despite his claim, police were anxious to question him and search his residence.
We had hopes of being able to look through his house, try to determine whether or not he may have been involved in this, and also we had hopes that we would be able to find Jody alive.
Because Higginbotham was the last person seen with Jody, investigators were able to obtain a search warrant. Whatever he was hiding, investigators hoped to find the answers in his house. Wichita and Newton, Kansas police struggled to solve the disappearance of 28-year-old Jody McCown. She was last seen with a man named Chester Higginbotham. When investigators arrived at Higginbotham's house, nobody was there. Armed with a warrant, they began searching for clues. Detective T. Walton found nothing to suggest murder.
We were picking up fibers from carpeting. We were looking at his boots and his shoes. We were looking for a body, but we did not find a body inside the house.
Investigators were pondering their next move when a car pulled up in front of the house and a couple got out. The man calmly identified himself as Matthew Murphy and asked what was happening. Investigators produced a warrant and brought them to the station for questioning.
Have a seat in that chair.
Under interrogation, Murphy admitted his real name was Chester Higginbotham.
Mr. Murphy, we're here to ask you a few questions.
He claimed he assumed an alias when he and his wife were placed into the federal witness protection program. According to Higginbotham, they were both witnesses in a mob-related murder case. Higginbotham reiterated his original account, that he picked up a girl fitting Jody McCown's description on September 16th. He said she was leaving town, so he dropped her off at the bus station around midnight.
Okay, we want you to.
To detectives, his story didn't quite ring true.
His times of dropping Jody off were not consistent with the times that our bus stations were open here in Wichita, either the city buses or the trailway buses. By going in and questioning him about that, he was still insistent that that's what he did. We knew that that could not have been true.
At the investigators' request, Higginbotham agreed to submit blood, hair, and saliva samples in the event a DNA comparison was called for in the future. Detectives also spoke with his wife, Vicki. She told them she didn't know her husband's real name was Higginbotham and contradicted his assertion that they were in the witness protection program. Vicki also said her marriage was troubled and she believed her husband was seeing other women. When asked about the night Jody McCown disappeared, Vicki said she came home from work and found a note from her husband. He said he was going to pick up parts for a car he was working on at a rented garage. When he hadn't arrived home by 3 a.m., Vicki drove to the garage to look for him. She said she caught him with a girl in his car. Although her husband wouldn't let her near the vehicle, she could see a girl with brown hair in the passenger seat. When Vicki confronted her husband, he claimed he was only giving the girl a ride. Vicki told him to come home immediately and then left. She said her husband arrived at the house about 5 minutes later. Based on the contradictory information obtained from Vicki, investigators questioned Higginbotham again. When they asked him about the girl at the garage, he claimed she was a friend from a local bar. But detectives suspected it was Jody McCown. Armed with a warrant, police searched Higginbotham's rented garage. Inside the suspect's car, they found a wad of green duct tape with hair stuck in the adhesive. Investigators also collected a white button with thread, black zip ties, a roll of green duct tape, and yellow rope. Detectives now believe Chester Higginbotham had murdered Jody McCown, but they still couldn't prove it without a body. Over the course of several weeks, investigators conducted a thorough search of the area surrounding his rented garage, but they didn't find anything. Without Jody McCown's body, it appeared Chester Higginbotham might be getting away with murder. Weeks after her disappearance, Wichita police were no closer to finding Jody McCown. Though they suspected a man named Chester Higginbotham was involved in her disappearance, they had no solid proof that a crime had even been committed. On October 11th, nearly a month after Jody's disappearance, a county groundskeeper working on the outskirts of town made a grisly discovery. The decomposed body of a woman lay in a ditch by the side of the road. When investigators arrived, they believed they'd finally found Jody McCown. The victim lay face down. A sweater and various undergarments were found near the body. As they searched for clues, the scene yielded a wealth of physical evidence.
She had the black plastic zip ties on her. She had green duct tape, just like was found in the shed, wrapped completely around her head, covering her nose and mouth area. The hands and feet were bound together with yellow rope that was similar to the rope that was all in the shed.
Fingerprint analysis confirmed the victim was Jody McCown. The medical examiner performed an autopsy and collected hair and fiber evidence from the body. She removed the duct tape for further analysis. Based on her findings, the medical examiner ruled the probable cause of death was asphyxiation caused by the duct tape covering the victim's nose and mouth. Due to the advanced decomposition of the body, the medical examiner was unable to determine whether Jody had been sexually assaulted. And there was insufficient material for DNA analysis. Detectives would have to build their case on other evidence. At the Wichita Police Department Crime Lab, evidence technician Patrick Cunningham hoped the duct tape would lead investigators to her killer. Using a solution called gentian violet, Cunningham looked for latent prints left on the tape. When the dye comes into contact with human protein residues, like those left by fingerprints, a vivid purple stain appears. When the tape from Jody McCown's body was put into the gentian violet solution, the results were disappointing.
And when we examined the back side of it, near the torn edge, there were some partial fingerprint impressions in that area, but there wasn't enough minutia for comparative purposes.
Forensic examiners had one last chance to make their case against Chester Higginbotham. At the Sedgwick County Regional Forensic Science Center in Wichita, forensic examiner Gary Miller would use fracture analysis to try to prove the duct tape from Jody's body came from the roll of tape in Higginbotham's rented garage. First, he painstakingly separated individual pieces from the tape recovered from Jody's body. Then, he analyzed the torn edges to establish the sequence in which the pieces had been torn from the roll.
Upon aligning the torn edge, we can go and see that the fractures, such as a jigsaw puzzle, fits together, but we're also able to align that the spacing between these threads are consistent, and visually we can tell from the color they are consistent.
Miller's analysis proved that the roll of duct tape collected from Higginbotham's garage had been used to bind Jody McCown. Forensic scientists also compared fibers recovered from the victim's clothing with carpet fibers taken from Higginbotham's car. Under a microscope, the texture and color of the fibers were consistent. Detectives had finally established physical links between Jody McCown and Chester Higginbotham. Scientists then compared the button and thread found at the garage with those on Jody McCown's shirt. They carefully measured the buttons, noting similarities in size, design, and material. The threads from the garage and the victim's shirt were consistent. In the end, forensic science had given detectives enough evidence to make a homicide charge stick. Based on the evidence, police reconstructed the sequence of events on the night Jody was murdered. They believe Chester Higginbotham took Jody McCown to the rental garage. He overpowered her, bound her with duct tape, and killed her. He then disposed of the body in a ditch by the side of the road. Chester Higginbotham, also known as Matthew Murphy, was convicted of first-degree murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole. Once, time and the elements could destroy evidence linking a killer to his victim. But forensic technology has found new ways around these obstacles. Investigators can overcome impossible odds and bring justice to murder victims who were long considered missing. An unidentified body turns up in the woods of North Carolina. With no motive and no suspects, investigators struggle to find the killer. In California, a housewife is taken into custody. When no record of her arrest turns up, detectives begin to fear the worst. A tragic horse accident ends the life of a Montana woman. But examiners uncover the markings of murder. When a crime scene yields vague clues, detectives must piece together their case through other means. Forensic science has found ways to uncover motive, exposing those who kill for love or money. North Carolina's northwest corner is dominated by rugged terrain, its landscape untouched by the problems of city life. That was about to change. On January 7, 1994, a Department of Transportation worker surveyed some land near a rural highway. He made a horrifying discovery. Investigators from the Watauga County Sheriff's Department were called to the scene. Hidden among the overgrowth, they found a body. Though the cool weather helped preserve the body, investigators determined he had been there for some time. The victim, a male in his 30s or 40s, had gunshot wounds on the left temple and right side of the neck. The body was completely nude, except for a watch and ring on his left hand. But other than the jewelry, there wasn't much evidence to identify the victim or tie him to his killer. Investigators scoured the scene around the body, searching for any scrap of evidence. A few feet from the body, they found a piece of black electrical tape. The single strand of tape was collected and sent to the crime lab for analysis. Captain Paula Townsend worked the case. Hoping to identify the John Doe, she entered what little information she had into the police database.
We knew that we did not have any outstanding missing persons in our county, so we would have to make some effort to locate a missing person from another area and determine his identity.
They didn't have to wait long. Later that evening, detectives got a call from police in nearby Salisbury. A man in their town had been reported missing several weeks before. He fit the description of the dead body found along the road. His name was Victor Gunnarsson. Salisbury police agreed to forward their case file. An autopsy showed that 2 bullets to the head had ended the victim's life. Analysis of the stomach showed the presence of undigested potatoes, eaten within 5 hours of his murder.
Thank you.
Townsend searched through Gunnarsson's case file, looking for any clue that could help her identify him as the victim. There was nothing conclusive. But if Gunnarsson was the victim, Townsend learned he had a sensational past.
Victor Gunnarsson was actually a Swedish national. He had come to the United States seeking political asylum because he had actually been criminally charged with assassinating the Prime Minister Olof Palme in Sweden a few years earlier.
Gunnarsson had been held as the primary suspect in the assassination, but was released when no witnesses could identify him as the killer. Watauga investigators were having a similar problem. To confirm that the body was his, investigators requested his fingerprints, which were on file at Interpol. A week after the body was found, the prints arrived in North Carolina. They matched. Now, police had to determine why someone wanted Victor Gunnarsson dead. His notorious past could not be ignored.
When we learned about what had happened to him in Sweden, we didn't know if it was related or not. We did have to consider that possibility that there was some political motivation in his death.
The small-town murder had huge international implications. But as investigators probed Gunnarsson's final days, they learned he had other problems close to home. In January, having heard about the case on the news, a woman named Kay Whedon came forward to make a statement. She'd met Gunnarsson on Thanksgiving and had been out with him several times that week.
About 2 months ago.
But after their last date on December 3rd, she hadn't heard from him again.
Your friend is dead.
That night, he'd taken her out to dinner. Whedon confirmed that Gunnarsson had eaten a baked potato at that time. Based on the autopsy results, investigators knew that this was his last meal. After dinner, Whedon invited him back to her place. But they were not alone. Whedon's ex-boyfriend, L.C. Underwood, and a friend named Shelley Thompson cruised by the house around 11 p.m. It wasn't a friendly visit. Kay Whedon described her stormy 2-year relationship with Underwood to police. Though they'd broken up, he refused to let her out of his life.
He had stalked her for some time. He was very jealous and obsessive. There were several incidents where he had confronted her when she was with another date. And the fact that he drove by on the night of December 3rd when Victor Gunnarsson was in her house caused him to be a suspect in this case.
The theory that Gunnarsson was the target of a political assassination was losing its credibility. L.C. Underwood's obsessive jealousy made him a prime suspect in the Swede's murder. But it wouldn't be an easy case to pursue. In addition to being a suspect, he was also a cop.
L.C. Underwood had been in law enforcement for 19 and a half years. He began his law enforcement career in Wilkesboro, North Carolina, and he later moved through a couple of other agencies before he finally moved to Salisbury, and he had been a police officer in Salisbury for about 8 years.
Pointing the finger at a police officer is tricky business. If investigators' suspicions about Underwood were wrong, they'd be destroying a colleague's professional and personal life. But if they were correct, they'd be fighting an uphill battle against someone who knew how to hide evidence. To make their case, investigators would have to stay one step ahead of Underwood. Instead of confronting him directly, Detectives began by questioning the people around him. Shelley Thompson had been in the car when the suspect drove by Whedon's house.
What is the...
Underwood had told her that he was doing a favor for a friend when he drove by and jotted down Gunnarson's license plate number.
I don't know where
Thompson said that when they returned to his house, he called the station and asked a colleague to run the plates.
Has you had any contact?
Investigators confirmed that Underwood was given Gunnarson's name and address that night.
Do you have the time to do that now?
The information was enough for police to obtain a warrant to search Underwood's home. They were about to confront a fellow police officer, a prime suspect in their murder investigation. As they searched his house, investigators asked Underwood what he knew about Victor Gunnarson's murder. Not only did Underwood deny any knowledge of the crime, he claimed he'd never even heard the name before. The suspect had just been caught in a lie. But that didn't prove murder. Investigators needed solid physical evidence to connect him to the crime. The initial search of the immaculate home contributed nothing to the case. If Underwood had killed the Swede, he was too smart and too organized to leave a smoking gun. The only way to catch him would be to find less obvious clues in unexpected places. Behind the washing machine, they noticed something they had seen before. A piece of black electrical tape, like the one found near Victor Gunnarson's body. It appeared the meticulous cop had underestimated his colleague's determination. Watauga County, North Carolina police struggled to solve the murder of 38-year-old Victor Gunnarsson. In the home of the prime suspect, police officer L.C. Underwood,
Here, come on back over here.
investigators found a critical piece of evidence, black electrical tape.
One particular piece of tape that was found on the back of Underwood's dryer in his utility room was consistent in several ways with the tape that was found at the crime scene near Victor Gunnarson's body.
The unlikely clue was turned over to the Trace Evidence Department at the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. Technicians compared the sample with the tape found at the crime scene. Trace evidence expert Troy Hamlin studied and compared the characteristics of the two samples.
The physical dimensions were compared, the width, the thickness, the composition was also compared, which were inorganic and organic characteristics. All of these were consistent with one another, and therefore those two items of evidence could have originated from the same roll of tape.
It was a key finding, but the case against Underwood couldn't be made on the tape evidence alone. Detectives needed something to physically link the suspect directly to the victim.
Glove box papers out.
They obtained a warrant to search his car.
Right there.
But like his house, the vehicle was impeccably clean. Even the trunk was spotless. Still, investigators refused to simply walk away. The trunk liner was removed and sent to the lab for closer analysis. That, too, would be a struggle. The liner had been recently washed and vacuumed, removing a great deal of trace evidence in the process. Using sticky tape, examiner Troy Hamlin went over every square inch of the liner, searching for any microscopic clue that survived the cleaning. He found nothing. The veteran police officer, it seemed, was getting away with murder. But then, Hamlin spotted a minuscule clue that could potentially have enormous value. He plucked a single hair root, barely visible to the naked eye. Probing more carefully at that area of the carpet, he was able to extract 17 more hairs, deeply embedded in the weave. Hairs collected from the victim and those found in the carpeting were mounted on slides and analyzed under a comparison microscope. The microscopic analysis showed that the hairs were physically indistinguishable. Detectives finally had the break they needed.
When I received a phone call from the lab analyst who told me that he had found the head hair in Underwood's trunk mat that was consistent with Victor Gunnarson's, I was ecstatic.
But if their entire physical case was going to hang by this microscopic evidence, investigators needed irrefutable proof. Examiners determined that the hair contained enough material for a DNA analysis. The tests confirmed that the DNA sequence from the hair found in the trunk of the suspect's vehicle was the same as the DNA sequence taken from the victim's blood. With Underwood now physically linked to the murder victim, police finally had the evidence they needed.
Put his hand behind your back.
A warrant was obtained for his arrest. Underwood's game of cat and mouse had come to an end. Police theorized that on December 3rd, having seen his ex-girlfriend with another man, Underwood became enraged with jealousy. He paid a late-night visit to Gunnarson's apartment and abducted his rival. With his victim tied up inside the trunk, Underwood drove for over an hour before arriving at Gunnarson's final destination. He fired 2 shots into Gunnarson's head, then began the process of covering up his crime. In July of 1997, L.C. Underwood was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Fueled by jealous rage, L.C. Underwood would stop at nothing to keep Kay Wheaton in his life. Others will use manipulation and murder as a means to satisfy their desires. An hour north of Los Angeles, the Pacific Coast Highway winds its way through Ventura, a city of beautiful beaches, a thriving harbor, and a close-knit community. On May 6, 1996, Michael Daly contacted the Ventura Police Department to report his wife Sherry missing. He told police that his wife had driven their boys to school early that morning. When it came time to pick the children up 3 hours later, she didn't show. The 35-year-old woman was known as a loving and responsible mother. It wasn't like her to forget her children. He said that his wife had planned to do some shopping earlier in the day. No one had heard from her since. Detective Sean Conroy of the Ventura Police Department worked the case. He knew from experience that Sherry may have gone missing on purpose.
Well, the reaction to any missing persons case is generally, if a full-grown adult is missing, it's because they want to be missing.
But concerned family members didn't believe that Sherry would leave her children. They drove around town until they spotted Sherry's van in the parking lot of a discount store. They contacted police. Inside the vehicle, investigators found her keys, purse, and a Mother's Day gift she'd purchased at the store. There were no other clues, nor any indication of a struggle. The following day, detectives convened for their regular weekly meeting. One of the officers mentioned that a Ventura resident had called in about having seen a strange arrest the day before. It was in the same parking lot where Sherry Daly's van was found.
With her parents or other family members yet.
One of them told me was one of these the.
They paid a visit to the witness. He said he saw a woman fitting Sherry's description, being handcuffed by a blonde woman in a tan suit. The blonde appeared to be a law enforcement officer. He then saw the woman in handcuffs being placed into a green car and driven away. The witness tried to catch the license plate, but it appeared to have been masked over. Investigators were now hopeful that Sherry was not missing at all.
At that time, we felt that another police agency had come in our jurisdiction and made an arrest without notifying us. And we felt that by making a few phone calls that we would discover that the person in the missing persons report, Sherry Daly, had been arrested, and we had solved the case with just a few hours' work.
But any hope for a speedy resolution was
Last
soon
record was
crushed.
in 1990.
No law enforcement officer from Ventura or any other jurisdiction had any record of such an incident. Police now believed they had a kidnapping on their hands. And with no communication from the kidnapper, they feared they might also be looking at a homicide. Detectives wanted to interview Michael Daly in greater detail, but when they went to talk to him, they found him with another woman. Her name was Diana Hahn. Both were brought in for questioning.
Tell me about your day yesterday.
Detective Skip Young interviewed Michael Daly.
In our first several conversations with Michael, he did not appear to be the worried, frantic, concerned husband that you or I may be. He was very matter of fact, didn't have a reasonable explanation as to why his wife would leave him.
Daly told police that at the time of his wife's disappearance, he'd been at the grocery store where he worked. The alibi checked out. Daly's girlfriend, Diana Hahn, denied any knowledge of Sherry's whereabouts. But it wasn't her statement that raised suspicions.
You got a scratch on your forehead?
Hidden beneath her bangs, Hahn sported some fresh scratches.
How did you say we see those injuries?
She claimed she'd had a bike accident and tumbled over the handlebars. Investigators weren't buying the story.
We know from years of police experience that it's impossible for someone to fall over the handlebars of a bike without putting their hands out to break their fall. It's an automatic reflex. Yet she had no injuries on her hands. She had no injuries on her knees. We knew at that point that she was lying to us.
Place a roller up against the bruise.
Photographs of the injury were taken. In the pictures, investigators could also see faint bruising on her arms and hands. It appeared that someone had gripped her so tightly that they even caused bruises to her fingers. Police suspected that Hahn was involved in the kidnapping. She didn't own a green car, but she could have rented one. Investigators canvassed rental car agencies in the Ventura County area. They learned that a car was rented the day before Sherry's disappearance and returned the day after, with 126 miles put on it. The name of the renter, records showed, was Diana Hahn. Her credit card had been used to pay for the car, and her signature was noted on the form. Detective Conroy hoped that an examination of the rented vehicle would help them find out what happened to Sherry Daly.
Even though the abduction had happened, at least a week prior to this, the rental agency had not re-rented the car. We asked them why. The car had been returned with the rear view mirror knocked off of the front windshield.
Investigators confirmed the car rented by Hahn was green, exactly as witnesses had described. It was towed to the Ventura Crime Lab. There, criminalists processed the vehicle, searching for any sign of Sherry Daly. Throughout the car, they noticed staining. It appeared to be blood. To find out, technicians used moistened swabs to collect the samples. In the lab, the samples were placed in a tube with a chemical that reacts to blood. If blood is present, the swab turns bluish-green. Using this method, Ventura Police Detective Harry Scott got many conclusive results.
We found that there was blood on the passenger handle, the door handle on the inside. We found blood and were been washed up on the ceiling or the headliner area of the car, and also some blood in the trunk of the car.
Lab work confirmed that the blood was human. But there, investigators reached a dead end. Though they suspected the blood was Sherry's, they had no record of her blood type. But science has new ways around that obstacle. Technicians took blood samples from Dali's parents. From these, they generated DNA barcodes and compared them against the DNA rendered from the blood in the car. The results were unmistakable. The blood found in the car had come from the biological child of Sherry Dali's parents. But it was not an encouraging finding. The presence of her blood throughout the vehicle confirmed their worst fears. It was unlikely they would find Sherry alive. Diana Hahn was now the prime suspect. But since they didn't have a body, they couldn't prove that a murder had been committed. The police weren't the only ones looking for answers.
This is where the community stepped up, and friends of Sherry Dali each weekend morning would gather at the department store where she was abducted, and they would go out in search parties.
On June 1st, nearly a month after the abduction, searchers noticed the odor of decomposition in a remote location on the outskirts of Ventura. Scouring the area along the embankment, investigators found a human skull. They believed they had uncovered the final resting place of Sherry Dali. Police in Ventura, California, continued searching for Sherry Dali, a young wife and the mother of two who had unexpectedly disappeared. A month after she was reported missing by her husband, investigators believed they had finally found her. The search party combed the scene. In the area where the skull and skeletal remains were found, pieces of jewelry were also uncovered. The items were carefully collected in the hope that someone could identify them as Sherry Dali's. Investigators also found clothing identical to the outfit Sherry was wearing when she was last seen. Their condition told a lot.
We were able to match the clothing to the bones, and we were actually able to determine that there were numerous stab wounds through the shirt and through the bra that showed up on the ribs of the victim.
Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Sherry Dali. Analysis showed that whoever killed her did so with a vengeance. In addition to the multiple stab wounds, her neck had been severed with a sharp object. The medical examiner concluded that after a long, vigorous struggle, the victim had been nearly beheaded. The autopsy findings were consistent with the blood staining found in Diana Hahn's rental car. And if Hahn had endured a lengthy struggle with Dali, it would explain the scratches and bruising that covered the suspect's forehead and arms during her first interview. Detectives believed that Diana Hahn had killed Sherry Dali, but they didn't think she had planned the murder on her own.
Monthly phone totals for the last.
Searching Hahn's calling card records from the day of the murder, Detective Skip Young found evidence that her lover had been in on the plot.
The day of the murder, we were able to determine that there was at least 3 telephone communications from Diana Hahn to Michael Daly the morning of the actual kidnapping and homicide.
One of the calls was made to him from a payphone just minutes from the ravine where the body was found. It appeared that Hahn was checking in with Daly. Police focus turned back to the victim's husband.
Take a look at this one right here.
Investigators learned from witnesses that Michael Daly was a drug user and that he'd been flaunting his affair with Hahn for the past few years.
We learned from close friends and neighbors that Sherry had reportedly given Michael an ultimatum: clean up your act, knock off the drug use, drop the other woman, and supposedly Sherry was actually seeking the advice of an attorney.
Investigators speculated that with Sherry out of the way, Daly wouldn't have to comply with his wife's demands. He could pursue his new relationship without having to pay alimony or share his children.
A lot of activity during
To
that time
detectives'
period.
way of thinking, he had a lot to gain from his wife's disappearance. The evidence against Diana Hahn and Michael Daly was damaging, but investigators still hadn't physically connected them to the kidnapping or the murder.
He's at surfers.
If they were going to make a case stick, they'd need some evidence proving that Hahn had disguised herself as a blonde law enforcement officer. Again, the close-knit community came forward to help. A clerk who was following the case in the press told police that she remembered selling Diana Hahn a blonde wig sometime before the murder. The clerk also commented that she had noticed a photograph of a man and 2 children inside Hahn's purse. She assumed the photo was of Hahn's family. Police showed the clerk a photo of Michael Daly and his 2 kids. It was the same photograph the clerk had seen in Hahn's purse. Investigators learned that Diana Hahn couldn't have children of her own. They began to suspect that Michael Daly had manipulated her with promises of a bright new future.
We'll be in touch.
Detectives continued to build their case. They pored over Hahn's financial records, including copies of checks.
1503.
One of them was written to a large discount store just days before the abduction. The list of items purchased included a piece of poster board, plastic trash bags, a 2-piece tan uniform, and a hatchet. Police obtained a warrant to search Hahn's home. They never found the hatchet or the uniform, but they did locate a piece of poster board. The barcode number on the poster board was identical to that recorded on the receipt. They couldn't understand how the board fit on Hahn's shopping list until they took a close look at the shape cut out of it. It was exactly the same shape as a license plate. That explained why witnesses couldn't see a license plate number. Hahn had covered it over with a fake.
Okay, so we gotta be pretty serious about how we plan this.
But it was unlikely that Hahn thought of that herself.
What we should do is we should get a wig and...
Investigators believe that Daly masterminded the murder plot days in advance.
So it looks like she's getting arrested over some drug deals that I've done.
Motivated by the lure of a new life with Michael, Hahn was more than willing to dispose of the one thing she believed was standing in their way. Police believe that a disguised Diana Hahn approached Sherry as she was leaving the store parking lot. Pretending to be a law enforcement officer, she lured Sherry from the car and handcuffed her. The staged arrest worked to plan, but investigators believe that Sherry Daly quickly saw through the ruse.
It is our belief that within a short period of time after Sherry was abducted in the green vehicle, that she somehow recognized Diana Hahn, disguise and all. We can tell by the damage to the interior of the vehicle, mainly the rearview mirror had been knocked off, that Sherry obviously put up some type of a struggle.
But Sherry couldn't fight off her attacker. After driving her to a remote location, Hahn viciously stabbed Daly at least 17 times and placed the body into the ravine. Diana Hahn was arrested for the murder of Sherry Daly on August 1st, 1996. From her jail cell, she reluctantly implicated Michael Daly as the mastermind behind the plot. Daly was arrested the following November. Though the murder investigation had come to an end, Ventura would be forever haunted by the young housewife's tragic end.
All she wanted to do was to have a family, have a husband, raise her children. I still think about this case. I still think about what was going through Sherry Daly's mind when she realized that it was Diana Hahn behind the wheel and she was going to have to fight for her life.
Diana Hahn was found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Tried 6 months later, Michael Daly was also found guilty in the murder of his wife. He was also sentenced to life in prison. Diana Hahn and Michael Daly were willing to destroy a family in order to be together. When money is at stake, some family bonds can become twisted and deadly. Nestled in the Rocky Mountains of western Montana, Mineral County is known for its frontier feel. But simple lifestyles aren't immune from deadly mishaps. On November 28, 1995, Chris Hansen's wife Nanette went to the stable to feed the couple's horses. She never came back to the house. Hansen found his 34-year-old wife lying in the mud. She was cold and pale. Hansen called 911. He thought that maybe Nanette had been trampled by horses.
It's my wife.
She was either dead or dying.
I think she's dead. I think she's dead.
The operator immediately dispatched an ambulance.
All right.
When paramedics arrived, Nanette was not breathing. She had no pulse. All her husband Chris and stepson Scott could do was watch as they attempted to revive Nanette with CPR. At first, paramedics' efforts seemed promising. The victim took a single gasp of air on her own. But that breath would be her last. She was declared dead. Since they performed coroner's duties in this small town, the sheriff's department was also contacted. Chris Hansen told investigators he stumbled upon Nanette's body in the muddy trail next to the horse pasture. He said that after calling 911, he phoned his son, Scott Abe, but there was nothing they could do. Because of his multiple sclerosis, he had very poor eyesight. If he had seen her sooner, he may have been able to save her life. Returning from the accident scene to the Mineral County Sheriff's Department, Under Sheriff Anita Parkin had no reason to believe that Nanette's death was anything but an unfortunate accident.
And she did have some bruises that looked like maybe a horse stepped on her or something similar to that nature. And with the conditions in the barnyard, I could see where somebody may have been knocked down or slipped or something happened of that nature.
News of Nanette's death spread through the small 3,000-person community. With it, suspicions swirled. Within hours, friends and neighbors of the victim were calling the sheriff's department to voice their misgivings about the tragedy. No one in the community believed Nanette Hansen's death was an accident. Police in Mineral County, Montana continued their investigation into the death of 34-year-old Nanette Hansen, accidentally killed by one of her horses. But the community wasn't buying that scenario. close friends came forward to urge further investigation into Nanette's death.
So, I understand that you knew
To them, the accident didn't make sense. Nanette was experienced with the care and control of horses. She owned only gentle, slow-moving animals. The Mineral County Prosecutor's Office was receiving calls from the same skeptical friends. But so far, there wasn't any evidence to merit the town's suspicion. Attorney Sean Donovan consulted with the Sheriff's Department. They decided that the only way to dispel the rumors was to have the body autopsied.
And we both agreed that just for the sake of putting to rest these concerns that the neighbors had, we ought to just have that done, expecting nothing to turn up.
The victim's remains were transported to the State Crime Lab in Missoula. There, medical examiner Gary Dale was asked to determine what caused Nanette Hansen's death.
So generally, in fatal horse accidents, the fatalities are due to skull fractures, cervical fractures, and unless someone's rolled over by a horse. And there was no external evidence of any readily fatal type injuries. The injuries pretty much consisted of scrapes and bruises.
Nanette's skull hadn't been fractured. Her spinal cord was intact. There had been no severe bleeding. The injuries that were found were relatively minor. A network of small scratches on her head and a 2-inch bruise to the left temple. They shaved the hair overlying the bruise and noticed an unusual pattern on the scalp. They could not immediately identify the source of the injury. Nothing about these injuries fit the profile of a horse trampling. Internal examination of the body turned up a large amount of mud and barnyard debris in the victim's lungs. She hadn't died from trampling. She died of asphyxiation.
And in this case, you could raise a possibility that she was rendered unconscious by a blow, somehow slammed by a horse against the stall of the barn, and went down face first into this muck in the barnyard, and then that she basically drowned or suffocated in that muck. There, and then this one.
But there was a major fault in that scenario. Nanette had suffered only superficial head injuries. There was no evidence of any brain trauma that would cause her to lose consciousness. A grim new theory formed.
There was a fair probability that she was held face down into the ground, into the soft, wet soil, by her forearms, by her hands, and that pressure was being applied to her back and to the back of her head. She's basically being forced face first into that.
What had initially appeared to be an accident was now being called a homicide.
As soon as that happened, we switched from this being a coroner's inquest, which is how this had begun, to being a criminal investigation.
With a homicide case opened, the victim's husband, Chris Hansen, was brought in for questioning. They hoped that he could help them find out who might want his wife dead. Though Nanette Hansen's death had been ruled an accident, an autopsy led Montana investigators to open a homicide case. Detectives questioned her husband, Chris Hansen. The many bruises and scrapes on Nanette's body suggested there had been a struggle leading to her death. To find out if Chris Hansen had been on the other end of that struggle, they asked him to remove his shirt. He was covered with what looked like fingernail scratches. When asked to explain the marks, he claimed that he'd tripped and fallen inside the house. Hansen stated that with his multiple sclerosis and near blindness, there was no way he could have physically dominated his wife.
Thank you.
Though he was telling the truth about his MS, he appeared to be overplaying his handicap.
We later learned during the investigation that he was able to play dice and see the different dice was able to stand beside a pool table and know which number were on the balls, and that he had applied for and received a big game hunting license in 1994.
Go ahead and write down your statement as what occurred on that.
Though he may have been too weak to work, investigators believed he was strong enough to beat up his wife. Nanette's friends and co-workers said that she frequently had black eyes and bruises. Things had been particularly bad, investigators learned, since Chris's son, Scott Abe, came to town. The 31-year-old hadn't seen his father since he was a small boy. About a year before Nanette's death, he came for a visit and decided to stay. He rented a trailer just a few minutes away and started building a cabin on their property. For father and son, it was blissful reunion. Investigators began looking into Abe's background as well.
Did he say bad things about her other than that?
A co-worker told investigators that Abe had been very vocal about his hatred of Nanette. He boasted that he could stage an accidental death by nailing a horseshoe to a board and beating her with it. He said he would do anything to keep her from getting her hands on his father's property and inheritance. Abe appeared to have gotten his way. Poring over records, detectives learned that in the weeks before Nanette's death, Abe had prompted his father to financially separate himself from Nanette. Hansen complied. He canceled their joint credit cards and opened a new bank account in his name only. It wasn't enough information to make an arrest, but it did get the sheriff's department a warrant to search Abe's property. They searched for any objects that matched the mysterious pattern of cuts and bruises on the victim's scalp. In his trailer, they found a pair of boots. The tread pattern looked eerily familiar. In Abe's car, detectives made another discovery. A homemade weapon called a sap. A leather pouch filled with metal objects. The items were sent to the Montana State Crime Lab. Simply believing that the father and son team had killed Nanette was not enough to prove murder. Unless someone could draw an irrefutable link between this evidence and her injuries, the two would never be charged. Investigators' best hope was now in the hands of forensic expert Debbie Hewitt.
It's kind of like putting a puzzle together where you pick up this piece of puzzle and pick up this piece of puzzle and see if it will fit in the appropriate space. And when you do find that one final puzzle piece, you know that you have the complete picture all done.
Hewitt began her analysis with the boots. She pressed the treads into an inked pad, then made numerous impressions on clean white paper. These prints were then transferred to clear sheets of acetate. By placing the prints over a life-sized photograph of the wound, she could determine whether the boot made the injury. The sole pattern from Abe's boot matched the injury on Nanette's scalp. Hewitt repeated the same process with the sap, inking and printing the weapon from a variety of angles. When compared against the large bruise on the victim's temple, the last piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place. The sap was shown to be a perfect fit for the wound on the side of Nanette's head. Father and son had teamed up to do away with the woman who came between them and their greed.
You're under arrest for the murder.
But their plot didn't hold up to forensic scrutiny. On February 2nd, 1996, Chris Hansen and Scott Abe were arrested. Prosecutors theorized that Abe first stunned Nanette with the sap, then wrestled her into the mud to make it look like an accident. While Hansen restrained her, his son placed his foot on her head, holding her down until she stopped breathing. Had it not been for the insistence of Nanette's close friends, this brutal act would have stayed buried forever.
If she had not been rerouted to the pathologist for an autopsy, we never would have seen these particular types of injuries and bruises, and the case would have been written off as an accidental.
Both Scott Abe and Chris Hansen were convicted of homicide and sentenced to 60 years in prison. When a murder is cleverly disguised, investigators must find new ways to see through the deception. They turn to forensic scientists to reveal the truth and to bring justice to victims who are killed for love or money.